Welcome to Capital Catch-Up, your deep dive into the halls of Congress. I am Victor.
And I am Leni. Today we are unpacking a substantial wave of legislative activity, starting with a major, multifaceted push on foreign policy, specifically targeting Venezuela, Nicaragua, and China.
That is right, Leni. Let us start in South America. Congress is looking closely at the political crisis in Venezuela following the disputed 2024 presidential election. We have three separate measures on this. First is Senate Bill 4809, the Venezuela Democratic Transition Act. This bill formally rejects the legitimacy of the Nicolas Maduro regime. It mandates that the Secretary of State develop a strategy to secure free and fair elections in 2026, support the democratic opposition, and ensure political prisoners are released.
It also requires the president to impose targeted sanctions, like asset blocking and visa restrictions, on those complicit in human rights abuses. But it does include waivers for humanitarian aid and national security.
Exactly. And then we have Senate Resolution 829, which addresses the subsequent leadership change where Delcy Rodriguez assumed the interim presidency. The Senate asserts that these interim authorities lack a legitimate electoral mandate.
Yes, and the resolution warns that any harm to opposition figures will be blamed on the interim regime, which could trigger United States accountability measures. On the House side, we see House Bill 7674, the Venezuela Democratic Transition Strategy Act. It requires the Secretary of State to submit a plan to Congress to counter foreign authoritarian influence from nations like Russia and China, while supporting civil society.
It seems Congress wants a coordinated, long-term approach, requiring annual progress reports and semi-annual consultations. And speaking of regional stability, the Senate is also focusing on Nicaragua with Senate Bill 5369, the Restoring Electoral Fairness and Opposition Rights through Mandates for Accountability Act of 2026.
This bill extends the Nicaragua Investment Conditionality Act of 2018 all the way through 2035. It targets the Ortega Murillo regime's corruption and persecution of religious and civil society groups. What is interesting here is that it specifically expands sanctions to Nicaragua's gold sector and restricts support for the governments of Russia and Iran.
It is a clear effort to isolate authoritarian regimes. And that brings us to China. Senate Bill 5370, the Combating the Persecution of Religious Groups in the People's Republic of China Act, aims to hold Chinese officials accountable for human rights abuses against Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, Uyghur Muslims, and Falun Gong practitioners. It directs the United States government to evaluate these officials for sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act.
For our listeners who might not know, the Global Magnitsky Act is a powerful tool that allows the United States to freeze assets and ban visas for foreign government officials implicated in human rights abuses. Under Senate Bill 5370, the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom would have to provide annual briefings to Congress on these efforts.
There is also a major national security focus on economic and technological competition with China. Let us look at Senate Bill 5316, the Biotech Investment National Security Act of 2026, or the BINSA Act. This bill amends the historic Defense Production Act of 1950.
The Defense Production Act is usually associated with mobilizing domestic industry during emergencies. But this amendment would classify biotechnology, including pharmaceutical development, biologics manufacturing, and clinical research, as prohibited or notifiable technology.
Right. It establishes outbound investment screening to stop United States capital from flowing into China's biotech sector. Proponents argue that current investment trends create strategic dependencies and accelerate China's dominance in the global pharmaceutical supply chain, which poses risks similar to semiconductors and artificial intelligence. The Treasury Department would set the rules, and the Department of Defense would have to report on how these capital flows affect military readiness.
We also see national security updates in House Bill 7688, the DPA Modernization Act of 2026. This bill updates the Defense Production Act of 1950 to streamline procurement. It creates a critical minerals resilience initiative to reduce reliance on foreign adversaries for strategic materials and addresses workforce and skills gaps in the defense industrial base.
Let us shift focus to some highly debated domestic issues. First, election administration. Senate Bill 5355, the Ballots by Election Day Act, proposes a major change to the Help America Vote Act of 2002. It would establish a uniform federal deadline requiring all absentee and mail-in ballots to be received by election officials by the close of polls on Election Day to be counted.
This would effectively stop states from accepting any ballots that arrive after Election Day, starting in 2027. However, there is a key exemption. It does not apply to ballots cast by military personnel and overseas voters. It is currently with the Committee on Rules and Administration.
Another significant domestic debate is over environmental standards for railroads. We have identical bills in both chambers: Senate Bill 1779 and House Bill 3194, both known as the Locomotives Act. These bills would amend the Clean Air Act to prevent individual states from setting their own emission standards for locomotives.
This is a classic federal preemption issue. Right now, some states want to set stricter environmental rules, but these bills would establish a single, uniform federal standard for locomotives engaged in interstate commerce. Proponents say this will eliminate fragmented, burdensome state regulations that disrupt railroad transportation.
Meanwhile, on the agricultural front, Senate Bill 5301, the Voice for Farm Workers Act, looks to support the agricultural workforce. It expands the role of the Department of Agriculture's Farm Worker Coordinator through 2031, focusing on job training, outreach, and connecting farm workers with federal benefits.
This is really about workforce stability and agricultural productivity in rural economies. And speaking of public lands, House Bill 9250, the Great American Outdoors Act 250, looks ahead to America's 250th anniversary. It establishes the America's Legacy Restoration Fund to tackle deferred maintenance across our national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges.
Yes, funded by energy revenues and donations, it specifically bans using these funds for buying new land or paying employee bonuses, focusing entirely on fixing existing public assets.
Finally, let us talk about government funding. We have three bills addressing the Department of Homeland Security: House Bill 4213, House Bill 7147, and House Bill 7744. These bills provide funding for agencies like Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Transportation Security Administration, and the Coast Guard.
What stands out across all three bills is the intense focus on fiscal accountability. They mandate strict monthly budget and staffing reports, detailed acquisition briefings, and rigid oversight on new pilot programs. Notably, House Bill 7147 includes $20 million specifically for deploying body-worn cameras for enforcement agents.
This emphasis on transparency, including audits by the Inspector General on non-competitive contracts, shows Congress is keeping a very tight leash on how Homeland Security funds are spent.
As we wrap up today, what should our listeners watch out for? Keep an eye on how the debate over mail-in ballot deadlines in Senate Bill 5355 progresses, and whether the Locomotives Act successfully limits state-level environmental regulations.
Also, watch for the implementation of outbound investment screening under the BINSA Act, which could reshape our economic relationship with China. That is all for today's Capital Catch-Up.
Thank you for listening. We will see you next time.